United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, while urging rich nations to cut emissions sooner, said the climate time bomb is ticking. Now, this comes after a new assessment from scientists warned there was little time to lose when it came to tackling climate change. Here is more on this.
The climate time bomb is ticking.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says there's little time to lose in tackling climate change, and rich countries need to slash emissions sooner. His latest call came in a recorded address after a new assessment from scientists.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. As today's report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, details, humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years.
Guterres said the panel's latest synthesis report should be seen as a survival guide for humanity. He urged developed countries to commit to reaching net zero emissions by the earlier date of around 2040. According to the IPCC, emissions must be halved by the mid-2030s if the world is to have any chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's a key target in the 2015 Paris Accord. But average temperatures have already spiked more than a degree, fueling more extreme weather events worldwide. Current estimates say the planet could warm by more than 3 degrees by the end of the century. And just meeting existing pledges may not cut it. Here's the panel's chair, Ho-Sung Lee.
We are walking when we should be sprinting.
Nations are expected to update climate pledges by 2025. This latest assessment will serve as a guide. If there's any chance of making the necessary emissions cuts, the panel says, the world needs to transform agriculture and eating habits and speed up the transition to green energy. The warning comes while it estimates nearly half the planet's population is already vulnerable to climate impacts.
For more on this, we are being joined by Alka Kelkar from Bengaluru in India. Now, she is the Director of Climate, World Resources, India. Welcome to the broadcast, Alka.
Thank you for having me, Shivan.
Alka, the IPCC report says the world has less than 10 years to meet our climate goals, and yet it seems the seriousness in the global discourse is still missing. How do you see the role of governments globally responding to this report?
I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. This report that has come out is actually the fourth in this series. Over the last 1.5 years, 3 parts of this report have already been sounding a very strong warning alarm. We had one report in August of 2021 on the science of climate change. Then we had 2 more in 2022 about the impacts of climate change and about the solutions to climate change. This is only the synthesis report, which all governments have agreed to, the summary for policymakers. So in a way, you can say that governments have been made more than well aware of the urgency of the situation. However, what this report can do is only indicate what is the science, what is the research saying. The actual action needs to happen at 2 levels. One is in the global United Nations forum under the UNFCCC COP, or Conference of Parties, which happens every year. Last year in November, it happened in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and this year it's going to happen in Dubai in early December. That's where countries come together and take strong action. This report tells you that now this action needs to be accelerated. We can't wait for even middle of the century or end of the century to reach global net zero. Some of the rich countries should advance their net zero targets to something closer to 2040, earlier than what they have been saying, in order to be able to stay within safe global warming. Right. The second level at which action needs to happen by governments is at the national level, because you could make an announcement or adopt a target in an international forum, but the action needs to happen back at home in states, cities, industries, and various other transportation and so on. The way for developed countries in particular, the rich countries in particular, is to convert their targets into laws so that we know that even if there are political changes, that the targets are not rolled back, and that every actor, every company, every city in society knows that these are the targets to reach. So that's when the seriousness of government will actually get translated into action on the ground.
Targets need to be turned into laws. That's, I mean, very aptly said. Alka, also the UN chief has urged rich nations to do more. Now, how do you see the climate justice debate playing out in the current world order?
You're absolutely right. There is, for example, a very startling statistic in this report saying that the top 10% richest people in the world are responsible for the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions. And the bottom 50%, like the half of the world's population at the bottom, is responsible only for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. So the action really needs to happen first by the richest countries and by the upper income people in those countries. One of the points that, in fact, the Indian government has been talking about is the need for lifestyle change, because there's no point in people who already have relatively limited access to energy. There's no point in expecting them to cut back on something where they're already leading a very frugal or scarce lifestyle. The change needs to happen right from the top. The other thing that needs to happen really is something called circular economy. While we produce a lot of things, we manufacture, there needs to be much more recycling happening. And that's also somewhere where the richer countries can take the lead in coming up with new technologies, which they can then make cheaper and make available to the rest of the world for material efficiency, not just energy efficiency. And the third thing is finance. Often what happens in reports like IPCC, the models show where the opportunities lie, and the opportunities for mitigation may lie in developing countries like ours. But the finance for realizing those opportunities needs to come from the rich countries. And many countries like the United States have been really quite deficit on coming up with their fair share of climate finance. And a lot needs to happen from the private sector as well, provided that the private sector also starts including climate change in its risk assessments. And finally, there's a big role for multilateral development banks like the World Bank to change and to increase the amount of funding that it is giving for climate action. And you're going to see a lot of that happening this year as well. There is a Paris Climate Summit that's going to be happening in June, and something called a Bridgetown Agenda about the reform of multilateral development banks, the entire financial infrastructure, in fact. And that's something to watch out for.
Definitely. Thank you for all those updates, Alka, and glad you joined in.
Thank you so much.